The rain came down with a vengeance, slicing through San Francisco's sky like a jagged wound. It pooled in the uneven sidewalks of the Mission District, turning alleys into rivers and corners into traps for the unsuspecting. On one such corner, Ava Monroe stood with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her coat barely holding back the cold that had been creeping into her bones long before the clouds opened up. She had known darker days, but this one felt particularly cruel. Her boots were soaked, her jeans clung to her skin, and her hands trembled. Not just from the chill, but from the weight of another rejection. Another gallery visit, another polite, smile, another, we're not taking on new artists this season. They didn't say what they really meant, that she wasn't a name, that her past, however brief its flash of promise, was not enough to convince anyone now. She was a fading star, one that barely flickered anymore. Ava turned the collar of her coat up higher and ducked under the narrow awning of a corner liquor store. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not again. The wind howled like a cruel laugh behind her as she pulled out her phone, hoping to summon an Uber before her last few dollars vanished with the rain. But her screen was cracked from an earlier fall. Just one more insult in a day of indignities. The GPS refused to load. She sighed and shoved the device into her coat pocket. Her breath came out in sharp puffs and her feet ached from walking all day. She had painted once, painted with passion and clarity. People had called her the next big thing. But now she was just a name on a forgotten mailing list, barely scraping by with freelance portraits and the occasional children's mural. As she stared out into the foggy street, a sleek black limousine pulled to the curb just a few feet away. It didn't belong there. Too clean, too expensive, too out of place in the heart of the Mission on a weekday afternoon. Ava blinked at it, unsure. Her Uber app had shown a black car last time. Could this be it? She hesitated only a second before the rear door clicked open. She took it as a sign, an invitation, or perhaps desperation had blurred her judgment. Ava rushed toward the car, yanked the door open, and slid inside without looking. Finally, she muttered breathlessly, brushing rain from her forehead. Please just go. Anywhere that's dry. The interior was silent. Not the kind of silence that offered comfort, but one that held its breath. A voice, smooth and low, cut through the stillness. I don't believe I called for a passenger. She froze. The man beside her wasn't a driver. He wasn't even looking at her. He was staring straight ahead, one hand on his knee, the other holding a phone he'd clearly just put down. His suit looked like it cost more than her rent. And his eyes, when they finally turned to meet hers, were the kind of storm grey that didn't need thunder to strike. I'm sorry, she stammered, reaching for the door handle, but something made her pause. It wasn't fear. It was curiosity. And something in his eyes told her he wasn't angry, just surprised, like he hadn't expected anyone to be bold enough to jump into a stranger's limousine in broad daylight. He tilted his head slightly. You're soaked and freezing. I thought this was my Uber, she said, her voice low, embarrassed. The app glitched and never mind, I'll get out. She was halfway out the door when his voice stopped her again. Where were you going? Ava hesitated, her hand still on the door. Nowhere that matters. His gaze lingered. The silence stretched. He made a quick gesture to the driver. The car began to move, slowly merging back into traffic. I wasn't expecting company, he said after a moment. But I suppose I could use some perspective today. Ava stared at him, stunned. Who are you? He extended his hand, dry and firm. Ethan Blackwell. The name struck something in her. A whisper from the news. A feature in Forbes. CEO of Blackwell Media. One of the youngest self-made billionaires in the state. The man had built an empire from scratch. A tech visionary. A recluse. A ghost, some called him, because no one ever saw him unless he wanted to be seen. And now he was sitting beside her, completely unbothered by the dripping stranger in his private car. I'm Ava, she replied cautiously, shaking his hand. Ava Monroe. He nodded once, then returned his gaze to the window. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was strange, calming, like a moment outside time. You said earlier, anywhere that's dry, he said, almost to himself. How long have you been out there? Ava laughed bitterly. Today, a few hours, but it's felt like years. Ethan's brow lifted. Bad day? She leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closing briefly. Bad year, maybe bad decade. I used to be someone. Or at least I thought I was. He didn't press her, didn't prod. Instead, he said something she didn't expect. There's a benefit gala tonight. At the conservatory, I'm scheduled to attend. Ava's eyes snapped open. And you're telling me this because? Because I don't want to go alone, he replied. And you just proved you're not like anyone else I know. She blinked. You want me to be your date? I want someone who isn't impressed by wealth or reputation. Someone who won't tell me what I want to hear. I don't own anything that remotely resembles a gala dress, she said flatly. I can fix that. He didn't smile. He wasn't charming, but he was sincere in a way that disarmed her more than flattery ever could. And for reasons she couldn't name, not hunger, not ambition, Ava said yes. That night, as the limousine pulled up to the Conservatory of Flowers in Golden Gate Park, she stepped out in a deep green gown, her hair swept elegantly back, her heart pounding like a drum. And at her side, Ethan Blackwell offered her his arm, not with pride, but with purpose. They walked into the gala under 1,000 eyes, and Ava Monroe, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. What she didn't know yet was that this night, this rain-soaked mistake would be the catalyst for everything that followed. Because sometimes a storm isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning. Ava Monroe had never felt more aware of the space around her than when she stepped into the Conservatory of Flowers that night. The scent of orchids drifted through the air, blending with soft classical music and the murmur of socialites in tuxedos and gowns. Her heels clicked on the marble floor, too loud for her liking, and the gown that hugged her frame, tailored just hours ago, felt like it belonged to someone else. Beside her, Ethan Blackwell walked like a man who belonged in every room he entered, not with arrogance but with a kind of silent dominance. His presence was undeniable, and the room shifted subtly as they passed through it, guests turning, whispering, watching. They were no longer just attendees at a charity gala. They were a spectacle. Ava wasn't sure if she was being protected or displayed. Ethan leaned toward her just slightly and said, "They're trying to figure out who you are. Let them wonder." She didn't respond. Her heart was still racing, not from nerves exactly, but from the surreal absurdity of the moment. A few hours ago, she had been drenched, desperate, and borderline hopeless. Now she was arm in arm with one of the city's most powerful men, and every woman in the room was calculating whether she was a threat, a plaything, or a joke. They paused, near the edge of the ballroom, where a string quartet played beneath a cascading chandelier. A waiter offered them champagne. Ava took a flute but didn't drink. Her fingers trembled, just slightly. Ethan noticed. "You don't have to stay long," he said quietly. "A single lap around the room and we're done." She looked up at him. "Why am I here, Ethan?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he guided her through the crowd with a gentle but unyielding touch on the small of her back. Every step drew more attention. Ava felt their eyes, but she kept her chin high. Near the center of the room, they came face to face with a woman who seemed carved from glass. Tall, elegant, with sharp eyes and sharper intentions. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan," she said smoothly. "It's been a while." "Vanessa," Ethan replied, his tone unreadable. "You look strategic." Vanessa's gaze shifted to Ava, her expression registering mild interest. "And who's this?" "Ava Monroe," Ava said before Ethan could. "Pleasure." Vanessa's smile didn't falter, but it thinned. "What an unusual choice for the evening." "I find the usual exhausting," Ethan replied flatly. Vanessa excused herself moments later, clearly irritated, and Ava finally exhaled. "She's the ex, isn't she?" Ethan's mouth tightened. "Among other things." Ava sipped her champagne. That was subtle. That was survival. They moved again, stopping only briefly to acknowledge donors, board members, and business elites. Ava realized that Ethan wasn't just showing her off. He was reclaiming something. There was a tension in him she hadn't seen before, a kind of defiance. It wasn't about the gala, not really. It was about control. And yet, beneath the sharp edges, she sensed something softer, a quiet despair he didn't show the world. They ended their lap near a balcony overlooking the gardens. Ethan opened the door for her, and the night air wrapped around them like a balm. The lights of San Francisco shimmered in the distance, reflected in the dark glass of Ethan's gaze. "I don't do this," Ava said finally, breaking the silence. "I don't pretend. I'm not good at it." "You didn't pretend tonight." "I don't know what this is." Ethan turned toward her. "It's nothing. Or it's something. I needed to be reminded that not everyone sees me as a bank account or a headline. Tonight, you reminded me. Ava leaned on the railing, letting the cool wind settle her thoughts. You don't know me. I could be 10 times worse than any of those people in there. I know enough, he said. You weren't afraid to. Look me in the eye. She met his gaze then. And you weren't afraid to let me in your car. They stood in silence, two strangers tangled in something that didn't yet have a name. When they returned inside, Ethan didn't guide her through the crowd this time. Instead, he followed her lead. She greeted a couple of guests with an effortless warmth that surprised even herself. She laughed once, genuinely, and he watched her like she was a discovery. Later that evening, as the event wound down and guests began slipping into their luxury sedans, Ethan and Ava exited through the rear atrium. The limousine was waiting. Inside, the silence between them felt different. Not strained, but saturated. Ava looked out the window as the city lights blurred past. She should have felt like a fraud, but strangely she didn't. Ethan broke the silence. Most people I invite to events like this ask what's in it for them. You didn't. That's because I didn't expect anything. And yet you stayed. I was curious. Still, she turned toward him. More than ever, he didn't touch her, didn't try to charm her, but he offered something much rarer, a truth. I don't trust people easily. I built everything I have from a place of isolation. I thought that was strength. And now? Now I'm starting to wonder if it's just another form of fear. Ava studied him. Maybe strength is learning to let someone see that. The car pulled to a stop in front of her building, but neither of them moved. I should go, she said, reaching for the door. He placed a hand on her wrist, not gripping, just a pause. Come to dinner with me. Not tonight, tomorrow. No suits, no crowds, just two people eating real food. She considered him. Do I get to pick the place? Of course. Then it's Thai. I don't trust anyone who doesn't like curry. His mouth twitched into something close to a smile. Then, we're already halfway there. She stepped out into the rain, but this time it felt different. Less like an ending, more like a beginning. Ava didn't know what she was stepping into. All she knew was that something had shifted, not just in the way Ethan Blackwell looked at her, but in the way she now saw herself. For the first time in a long while, Ava Monroe was no longer surviving a world that didn't want her. She was stepping into one that was just starting to see her worth. The day after the gala, the world seemed quieter, or maybe Ava Monroe had simply become more aware of its nuances. A storm had rolled through San Francisco, but now the sky was painted in gentle blues, the clouds scattered like retreating soldiers. Ava stood at the window of the penthouse suite Ethan had arranged for her. Temporarily, he'd said, just until she was settled. She hadn't yet asked what that meant or how long she was meant to stay. Part of her didn't want to know. Below her, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm. Cable cars clattered down the hills, pedestrians hurried with purpose, and the bay shimmered in the morning light. Ava pressed her hand to the glass, grounding herself in this unexpected present. Her life had been filled with sharp turns lately, and the night before had been the sharpest yet. The gala wasn't just a social event. It had been a portal, an invitation into a world that didn't belong to her, but hadn't rejected her either. That thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Later that morning, Ethan sent for her. Not through a text or a call, but a handwritten note slid under her door. Come to the gallery hall on the west side of the building. I want to show you something. It was signed simply. Curiosity piqued. Ava made her way through corridors that gleamed with clean lines and expensive stillness. The gallery hall was a private space in Ethan's residential tower, not open to the public, but used for corporate guests and foundation events. She expected oil paintings, curated installations, something clinical, impressive, detached. She didn't expect photographs, black and white, intimate, raw. The first frame stopped her cold. A boy, no older than 10, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders. They were in a modest kitchen, flour on their hands, joy in their expressions. Ethan and his mother. Ava moved slowly through the room. The photos were unmarked, but they told stories. Ethan learning to ride a bike, sitting alone at a school desk, standing beside his father at a boardroom table, eyes blank. His first media award, his first feature on Forbes. And then a stretch of images that shifted everything. Ethan behind a glass wall, alone in a hospital waiting room. Ethan in his 20s caught in a rainstorm outside a cemetery gate. A close-up of a closed fist, knuckles white. Do you still think I'm a man who can't feel? His voice behind. Her didn't startle her because she'd felt him enter. Ava turned slowly. No, she said. But I think you've learned to bury it so deep most people never bother to look. Ethan walked beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the frames. My father had this room curated after my mother died. He wanted to preserve what he thought would be useful to the brand, a backstory, something relatable. But these were never for the press, just me, and maybe someone else someday. His voice had lost its usual polish. Here, in this space, he wasn't the untouchable mogul. He was a man tangled in grief and memory. She was your anchor, Ava said. She was everything I didn't understand until I lost it. They stood in silence, the kind that expands instead of presses down. Then Ethan spoke again, softer this time. Vanessa never set foot in this room, said it was too heavy, too human. Ava looked at him. I think it's the most honest thing I've seen since I walked into your life. He studied her then, as if the words had peeled something away. I meant what I said last night, he said. You're different. Not because you don't belong in my world, but because you don't need it. She nodded. That's not the same as not wanting it. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with intrigue. Do you? Want to know what it feels like to stop holding my breath, she replied. To stop surviving and start living again. It was the truest thing she had said in a long time. Later that afternoon, they drove to a private lounge in Pacific Heights for a luncheon hosted by the Blackwell Foundation. This time, Ava dressed herself. Nothing extravagant, just a fitted blazer, dark jeans, and boots that carried quiet confidence. She no longer felt like an imposter. Still out of place, yes, but no longer invisible. The lounge was filled with people who shaped the city's future, developers, investors, politicians. Ava recognized the performance immediately. Smiles stretched too wide, compliments laced with calculation. She leaned in close to Ethan and whispered, Does anyone here actually like each other? He grinned. They like being seen with each other. They mingled, their pairing drawing curious glances and occasional whispers. Vanessa was there too, orbiting like a hawk. Her dress was impeccable. Her words, when they came, were precise. Ava, she greeted with artificial warmth. You clean up beautifully. Ava smiled. I've had a lot of practice. Vanessa's eyes flicked to Ethan, then back to Ava. He doesn't bring women to these events. Not ever. You must be something special. Ava held her gaze. Maybe he finally wanted someone who doesn't care what people like you think. Vanessa's expression hardened just briefly before she retreated with a glass of champagne and a plastic smile. Ethan said nothing, but his expression, part amusement, part admiration, spoke volumes. On their way back to the car, he asked, Have you ever thought of doing this for real? Attending social functions with you? No. Living this life, being seen, heard, rebuilding. Ava tilted her head. Why? Are you offering? Ethan stopped walking. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. I'm asking, he said. She searched his face for the catch, the play, but there was none. Then let me ask something in return, she said. What do you want from me? He took a breath, like he was choosing honesty over safety. I want someone in my life who doesn't flinch when I'm quiet. Someone who sees past the surface and calls out the parts I've hidden even from myself. And if that sounds selfish, maybe it is. But I've spent 20 years surrounded by people who only tell me what benefits them. I want something real. Ava exhaled. I'm not easy. I come with baggage, doubt, and 1,000 second guesses. Then maybe we're finally on equal ground, he replied. That night, back at the penthouse, Ava stood at the threshold of the balcony, watching the fog roll in over the bay. Behind her, Ethan poured 2 glasses of wine and handed her one. She took a sip, her fingers brushing his. No flinch, no walls, just warmth. This doesn't make sense, she said softly. Most things that matter rarely do. And as the city settled into twilight, they stood side by side, no labels, no promises. Just the quiet beginning of something neither of them had expected. Whatever this was, It was unfolding slowly, like the soft light of dawn after a long night. And Ava Monroe, for the first time in years, wasn't afraid to let it in. The sky over San Francisco had shifted from amber to steel by the time Ava Monroe stepped into Ethan Blackwell's private library. The room was unlike the rest of his penthouse, darker, quieter, unapologetically personal. Heavy shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from first editions to obscure philosophy texts. A fire crackled low in the hearth, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of the man waiting in the corner armchair. He looked up as she entered. No greeting, no pretense, just a silence that asked for something more than words. "I'm not used to people inviting me into their private places," she said as she sat across from him. "I don't invite many," he answered. "This space is not for show." Ava leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "Then why now?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Because I think it's time I told you something real." She waited. "My mother died when I was 10, he began. Electrical fire. It started in the kitchen. She was baking, listening to music. I remember that, the music. It kept playing while the flames climbed the walls." Ava's throat tightened, but she said nothing. "My father wasn't home. He was rarely home. After she died, he buried himself in work, moved us into a high-rise downtown, hired staff, sent me to boarding school by 12. That's when the story of Ethan Blackwell, the 5-hour prodigy the businessman, began. But the truth is, I was just a boy who lost his anchor and learned to mimic confidence." He didn't look at her as he spoke. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the fireplace, as if the truth might hurt less if it were told to the flames. "I used to have night terrors. Couldn't stand the dark. I'd sleep on the floor of my closet with the light on until I was 15. By then, my father had remarried. Vanessa wasn't just his business partner, she was his way of ensuring control. She treated me like a product, polished, packaged, and positioned." Ava could feel the heaviness behind each word. This wasn't confession for sympathy. It was excavation. "Did anyone ever try to pull you out of that?" she asked gently. Ethan gave a hollow laugh. "People tried to use it. Therapists my father paid. Teachers who saw potential. Girls who loved the story more than the boy inside it. And Vanessa? She saw potential too, strategic potential. We were engaged once. I broke it off the moment I realized I wasn't her partner. I was her trophy." A long silence followed. Ava stood and crossed to the window, watching the clouds drift low over the city. "You think all of this makes you incapable of love?" "I think it made me guarded," he said. "Worse, I think it made me cruel in subtle ways, detached, transactional. I didn't even realize how much until you walked into my car that day." She turned. "Because I didn't want anything from you." "No," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Because you reminded me what it feels like to be seen without expectation." The weight of his gaze was almost too much. Ava felt it in her chest, like a truth too big to contain. She crossed the room slowly and sat back down. "I was engaged once too," she said, "to a man named Colin. He was charming, ambitious, said all the right things." She paused, gathering herself. "He was also my mentor in the art world. Helped me get my first showcase. Told me he believed in my work more than anyone else. I was naive. I thought that meant something sacred. But he stole my portfolio, repackaged my art under his name, and sold it to investors while telling me I wasn't ready for success." Ethan's expression didn't change, but his fists clenched on the arms of his chair. "I confronted him," Ava continued. "He said it was business, that I should be flattered. When I tried to expose him, no one listened. He had the name, the reputation. I had nothing. I disappeared from the gallery scene overnight. The whispers started. People assumed I'd plagiarized him, not the other way around. It broke me. Not just the betrayal, but the silence, the ease with which the world let it happen." There were no tears in her voice, only clarity, a kind of earned stillness. Ethan leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "Because I didn't want it to define me again," she said. "I've lived in the shadow of that story for years. I wanted you to know me, not my ruin." He nodded slowly, as if understanding ran deeper than agreement. After a long pause, Ethan walked to the desk and opened a drawer. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the coffee table between them. "What's this?" she asked. "An offer," he said. 30 days. I'll sponsor a new exhibition under your name." A solo gallery, all proceeds go to you. In return, I want you to stay here. Attend events with me. Be my partner, publicly. Ava stared at the folder. You want me to pretend to be your fiancé? He didn't flinch. Yes, but it's more than PR. I want to see where this goes. I want to know if what we're building can survive outside these walls. She looked at him. And if it can't? Then at least we were honest about it. Ava reached for the folder, her fingers brushing the leather binding. It felt unreal, terrifying, but something inside her stirred, not fear, not pride, hope. Any rules? She asked. Ethan nodded. No pretending when it's just us, no lies, and no expectations for what this has to become. Ava opened the folder, read the first few lines, then closed it. 30 days, she said. But I won't play a part. I'll be me, whether you like that or not. Ethan's mouth curved just slightly. That's exactly what I want. That night, Ava moved into the upper floor of the penthouse. A guest suite, technically, though it felt more like crossing, a threshold. She stood at the window once more, this time not as a visitor, but as someone tethered to a future not yet written. The city blinked below, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place between two people whose lives had been shaped by silence and survival. Ethan passed her in the hallway as she unpacked. He didn't say anything but paused at her door. You okay? He asked. I think so, she replied. He nodded and turned to go, but then he stopped. Thank you, he said, for trusting me with your truth. Ava closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her heart thudding in her chest. This wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something just as rare. It was the beginning of trust. And for two people who had been burned by the very idea of closeness, that was its own kind of miracle. Ava Monroe hadn't signed a love story. She'd signed a contract, 30 days of carefully crafted appearances, intimate glances shared in public, dinners with city. Elites where her role was clear but unspoken. On paper, it was strategic. For Ethan Blackwell, a businessman known for his detachment, appearing with someone grounded and authentic was a counterweight to his reputation. For Ava, it was a lifeline, an opportunity to reclaim the identity that had been stolen from her. But what neither of them anticipated was how easily reality blurred into something else. The contract sat in a drawer in Ava's suite, neatly signed and bookmarked with the schedule Marcus provided her. Media appearances, charity luncheons, business openings, all curated to quietly suggest the story of Ethan Blackwell finding someone unexpected, someone real. It was all carefully orchestrated, and yet nothing about the way Ethan looked at her felt rehearsed. She began her days early, often before the rest of the penthouse stirred. Mornings were spent revisiting her sketchbooks, lines spilling from her fingers like rivers breaking through a long frozen dam. She hadn't drawn freely in years, not like this, without fear, without someone looking over her shoulder, judging what each stroke might be worth. Ethan started joining her just after sunrise, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to watch. He never spoke during these moments, but Ava could feel the weight of his presence behind her, the quiet reverence he held for a world so different from his own. On the 7th morning, he said something that stayed with her. I never liked silence before, but with you it's different. It doesn't demand anything. She turned, surprised. Silence was always the only thing I could afford. He didn't answer, but she saw the shift in his eyes. Recognition, regret, maybe even longing. They cooked. Together in the evenings, mostly simple meals. Pasta, stir-fry, even grilled cheese on the nights they were too tired to pretend to be high society. Once she found him standing barefoot in the kitchen at midnight, pouring cereal into a bowl, like a teenager. You know you have a chef on call, right? She teased. I also have a reputation for being untouchable. Let's break both. They laughed until they cried, and Ava realized she hadn't felt that light in years. Then came the trip to Napa. It was Marcus's idea, on paper just another appearance, an annual vineyard benefit for the Blackwell Foundation. But Ethan insisted they go alone. No press, no assistance, just the two of them. Let them speculate, he said, but let us breathe. The car ride was long, filled with winding roads and quiet stretches broken only by music from an old playlist Ava had built for painting sessions years ago. She was surprised when Ethan recognized a few of the songs. My mother used to play this one, he said, fingers tapping the steering wheel to the rhythm. She said some melodies were doorways. Ava turned her face to the window, hiding the way those words pierced her. The vineyard estate sat nestled between rolling hills, golden with late summer sun. They arrived just before dusk. Ava wore a flowing cream dress, her hair caught in a breeze that made her look more like a memory than a woman. Ethan stared at her for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "You don't belong in this world," he said. She stiffened. "I mean that as a compliment," he added quickly. "You elevate it, make it feel honest." She didn't respond, not with words. Instead, she reached for his hand as they walked through the rows of vines. It was a simple gesture, but for Ethan, it was something far more dangerous. Contact unprovoked, unrehearsed, and he didn't pull away. At the center of the vineyard, they sat on a blanket, a bottle of red between them, the sun sinking behind the hills. Ava poured a glass and handed it to him. "This moment," she said, "feels like it isn't borrowed." Ethan watched her. "Maybe it isn't." She took a sip and asked the question she hadn't dared voice before. "What happens after 30 days?" He set his glass down carefully. "I don't know. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have." She didn't press further. They both knew the contract had started to rot at the edges. The pretense was cracking. What they shared now didn't belong to obligation. It belonged to something growing in the spaces they didn't talk about. Trust, vulnerability, maybe even hope. The next morning, back in the city, everything felt louder, sharper. The illusion of the vineyard still clung to them, but reality knocked fast. Ava walked into the kitchen wearing one of Ethan's white button-down shirts. She hadn't meant to. She'd grabbed it absent-mindedly from the closet when her suitcase zipper jammed. But when Ethan saw her, holding a mug with her hair up and her legs bare beneath the hem, his breath visibly caught. She tilted her head. "Too domestic?" "Too perfect," he said softly. They stood like that for a beat too long, until the silence thickened with something fragile and dangerous. Ava broke it first. "We should talk about the gallery." Ethan nodded. "Marcus has already scouted 3 locations. I want it to be your name on the lease, your terms, no strings." "But there are strings," she said. "This, us." He met her eyes. "Only if you see them as knots." She set the mug down. "It's getting harder to pretend." "Then stop pretending." "It's not that simple." He took a step toward her. "It is for me." She didn't move, didn't speak, but something shifted in her gaze. Resistance softening, defenses faltering. Then, almost without thinking, she reached up and brushed a speck of lint from his collar. It was the most mundane gesture in the world, and yet Ethan didn't flinch. His body didn't tense. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if the touch itself was a confession. When he opened them, he whispered, "I don't want you to stop." Ava felt the air change between them. The weight of unspoken things, rising, pressing against her chest. She stepped back slightly, suddenly aware of the precipice they stood on. "Do you think we're falling?" she asked. "I think we already have." They didn't kiss. Not yet. The moment didn't demand it. But something had broken open between them. Something neither of them could undo. That night, Ava sketched until her fingers cramped. She drew Ethan, not the CEO, not the polished face from magazine covers, but the man who had confessed his ghosts and stood in a vineyard at sunset and poured cereal at midnight. And as she set down her pencil, she realized she was no longer drawing him. She was drawing the version of herself she hadn't believed could exist again. Free, alive, and finally seen. Ethan Blackwell had grown used to control, tight, measured, and exacting. But nothing about Ava Monroe followed rules. Not the way she looked at him, like she wasn't afraid of what she saw. Not the way her presence filled the quiet spaces of his penthouse with unspoken warmth. She moved through his world as if it wasn't foreign to her, but unfinished, like something waiting to be lived in. 3 weeks had passed since she entered his life, and in that time he'd stopped keeping track of board meetings, missed a handful of routine updates from his company's legal team, and most unforgivably, forgotten about a Forbes interview scheduled weeks in advance. When Marcus asked if everything was all right, Ethan simply responded, "For the first time, I think it might be." Mornings had taken on a new rhythm. Ava's coffee mug always sat to the left of his on the marble island. Her sketchbook rested beside it, open to a half-finished drawing or a random burst of handwriting that looked like poetry. She never explained what it meant, and Ethan never asked. He'd learned the art of letting her keep her corners, but it was the nights that changed him. They had dinner more often at home than at any gala or event. Ethan cooked sometimes, usually under her instructions. It was messy and unstructured, and he was terrible at it. But Ava laughed easily, even when the rice burned or he used salt instead of sugar. That laughter, it was undoing something in him he hadn't realized was knotted so tightly. One evening, she walked into the living room barefoot, wearing one of his sweaters that swallowed her frame. He was on the couch flipping through a binder of old foundation grant proposals. "You never rest," she said, curling up beside him. "I never needed to," he replied. "And now?" He looked at her. "Now I forget what I was working on." She didn't smile. Not fully. But the quiet shift in her eyes told him she understood. That something real had taken root between them, even if they hadn't named it yet. The next day, they attended a children's hospital opening that the Blackwell Foundation had funded. It was Ava's idea. She said places like that deserved faces, not just logos. Ethan agreed. At the hospital, she knelt beside a small boy battling leukemia and sketched him as a superhero, complete with a cape and a golden crown. His laughter filled the room. Ethan stood nearby watching her, something heavy and hollow cracking open inside his chest. A nurse approached him. "She's remarkable. Are you two married?" Ethan didn't answer right away. "No," he said. "Not yet, Yon." The drive home he was quiet. Ava noticed. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "I never thought I'd want more, but you make me wonder what I've been protecting myself from." That night, as she slept beside him, not in the guest suite but in his bed, after hours of talking about everything and nothing, Ethan watched her. Her face softened in sleep, the same face that had once appeared uninvited in his back seat and now felt more like home than anything he'd ever built. He reached for his phone and opened a secure document. It was a preliminary agreement for dissolving, a holding partnership with Vanessa Langford, a final cut from the past. His finger hovered over the screen. In the end, he didn't sign it then. He needed to tell Ava first. The morning came with fog rolling off the bay. Ava stood barefoot at the window, arms crossed as she stared into the white horizon. "I had a dream last night," she said softly. Ethan sat up. "What kind of dream?" "That I was painting on a rooftop and the sky turned into a canvas. But every time I reached for a new color, someone took the brush from my hand." He stood walking over to her. "Not this time." She looked at him, something vulnerable and sharp dancing in her eyes. "You can't fix me, Ethan." "I don't want to fix you," he said. "I want to be the one who stands beside you while you rebuild yourself." The words hung between them. Raw. True. They spent that weekend in the countryside. No agenda, no camera flashes, just long walks, quiet dinners, and late-night conversations on the porch. Ava asked him questions no one dared to. About the mother he still missed, the father he barely forgave, the sleepless nights he masked with ambition. And Ethan, for the first time, didn't deflect. He answered. One night, under the stars, she asked, "Do you ever think about what you'd be without all this?" He stared at the sky. "A man with less money, but maybe more peace. You think they're separate?" "I used to." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Maybe you were always both. You just needed someone to remind you." He turned, to her then, and kissed her, not out of hunger or habit, but reverence. It wasn't about possession. It was about gratitude, about being seen. Back in the city, things shifted. Ava was receiving invitations again. Galleries asking to preview her work, media outlets curious about the mysterious woman at Ethan Blackwell's side. But she was cautious. Fame had been the vehicle of her deepest betrayal once. She didn't want to lose herself in it again. Ethan offered to open a space just for her. No strings, full creative control. She hesitated. "I don't want to be the woman who needed you to find her voice," she said. "You already had the voice," he told her. "All I did was turn down the noise." She said yes. And so the sketch of something impossible became something real. Two people, scarred but open, tentative but daring, choosing to move forward, not because they needed each other to survive, but because they had learned, slowly, beautifully, how to thrive in each other's company, the soft clatter of wine glasses. And the low murmur of laughter filled the ballroom of the San Francisco Heritage Club. It was one of the year's most exclusive charity evenings, and Ava Monroe stood in the center of it all, draped in a midnight blue gown that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass as she scanned the room, not for admiration, though it followed her anyway, but for a sense of belonging she still wasn't sure she had earned. Ethan Blackwell stood nearby, charming a small circle of eyes, donors with the kind of ease that came from decades of being scrutinized, admired, envied. His tie was slightly loosened, his smile rehearsed, but his eyes never straying far from her. She was no longer the stranger in the back seat of his limousine. She was his partner, his presence, his quiet anchor in rooms that still carried the cold scent of performance. But Ava wasn't smiling. Something in the air had shifted. She first noticed it when Vanessa Langford walked into the room. The tension arrived with her, cloaked in silk and confidence, her expression carefully unreadable. She had avoided them for weeks, retreating into corporate obligations and closed-door meetings. But tonight she re-emerged, and the timing wasn't accidental. Vanessa made her way across the room, pausing only once to acknowledge a board member before locking eyes with Ava. "Lovely dress," she said smoothly. "I remember when Ethan favored bold color. You've tamed him well." Ava set her glass down gently. "I didn't tame him. I just reminded him he's allowed to feel." Vanessa's lips curled. "Feelings aren't currency in our world, Ava. But then again, perhaps that's why he's so drawn to you. You still believe in sincerity." Before Ava could reply, Ethan joined them. His expression didn't change, but Ava saw the muscle in his jaw tense. "Vanessa," he said evenly. "Surprised to see you here." She glanced between them. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Ava said. "We were just discussing feelings." Vanessa smirked, then turned to Ethan. "You always did prefer a woman who made you forget the rules." With that, she walked away, leaving a subtle trail of discomfort behind her. Ava turned to Ethan. What did she mean? He hesitated. "It doesn't matter," he said finally. "She's trying to stay relevant." But Ava's instincts told her otherwise. Later that night, back in the penthouse, Ethan was uncharacteristically quiet. He poured himself a scotch, stared out at the skyline, and avoided eye contact. Ava watched him from the kitchen island, a sense of unease tightening in her chest. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" He turned slowly. "Vanessa is preparing a lawsuit." Her breath caught. "What kind of lawsuit?" "Breach of fiduciary duty. She claims my involvement with you has compromised board neutrality and threatens to expose sensitive financial dealings." Ava blinked. "You're joking." "I wish I were." She walked to him, her voice rising. "But we've done nothing wrong. Everything between us has been private, personal." "She doesn't care about that," Ethan said. "She wants leverage. She wants control again." "And you didn't think I should know?" "I was trying to protect you." Ava stepped back. "From what? The truth? Or the consequences of being with you?" The words landed heavy. Ethan flinched just slightly. "I didn't want this to touch you," he said. "You've been through enough." "I get to decide that," she snapped. "You don't get to make choices for me like I'm one of your acquisitions." He ran, a hand through his hair, the cracks in his composure finally showing. "I'm trying to fix it." "I don't need you to fix it," she whispered. "I need you to trust me enough to face it with me." They stood in silence, the distance between them suddenly colder than the city outside. The days that followed moved like smoke, hazy, slow, suffocating. Ethan disappeared into legal meetings. Marcus hovered quietly, offering support that felt more like damage control. Ava, for the first time since entering Ethan's world, felt like a spectator in her own life. The media began speculating. An anonymous source leaked details about Ava's art gallery being funded by Blackwell Media. Headlines questioned her credibility, implying favoritism, scandal, and impropriety. She saw her name trending on platforms she had never wanted to trend on. Some called her a gold digger. Others painted her as a muse-turned-manipulator. The worst came one morning when she walked into the gallery and found a printed photo taped to the door. A shot of her and Ethan from the vineyard, circled in red marker with the words "bought" and "sold" scrawled beneath. She ripped it down with shaking hands. That night she waited for Ethan, but he didn't come home. When he finally returned, it was past midnight. His face was drawn, suit wrinkled, tie undone. "I didn't know where else to go," he said quietly. Ava crossed her arms. "This is your home." "Is it?" His voice cracked. "Because it doesn't feel like mine anymore." She took a long breath. "We can't keep pretending this is just a storm to ride out. Vanessa is trying to destroy you, and in the process, she's dragging me down with her." "I'll step back," he said. "I'll dissolve the public partnership, end the gallery contract, anything to protect you." Ava's eyes filled with tears, but not from gratitude, from heartbreak. That's not protection, Ethan, that's erasure. You don't get to erase me to save me. He stepped forward. Then what do you want? I want you to fight for us, not just for your legacy. I don't know how, he said. Everything I built by staying detached, strategic, alone. Well, maybe that's not enough anymore, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He closed his eyes and she turned away. That night, Ava packed a single suitcase. No drama, no shouting, just a quiet exit, her dignity intact, her heart shattered in silence. She left a note on the kitchen counter. 4 words, when you're ready. And then she disappeared. Ethan stood in the doorway the next morning holding that note, the weight of his empire suddenly meaningless. The world outside kept spinning, but inside, something had broken. Something he wasn't sure he'd know how to rebuild. Santa Monica in late autumn carried a warmth that Ava Monroe hadn't felt in months. Not just in the sun that glowed soft and gold on the horizon, but in the way the ocean exhaled against the shore as if the entire coast breathed with her. She had rented a small cottage just off Ocean Avenue, tucked between pastel houses with rose gardens and wind chimes. The sea breeze tangled her hair in the mornings as she sketched on the porch, and for the first time in a long while, silence didn't hurt. It had been 3 weeks since she left San Francisco. Since she left Ethan, her days had settled into a quiet rhythm. Coffee at sunrise, long walks with no destination. Painting not for commission, not for acclaim, but for herself. Canvases lined the wall of her studio like pages from an unspoken diary, pieces that told the truth of what it meant to love someone powerful and still feel powerless. What it meant to choose yourself even when your heart begged you not to. Each stroke on the canvas was both a rebellion and a surrender. She hadn't heard from Ethan, not a word, and she hadn't reached out either. She had told him when you're ready. But maybe she'd always known he wouldn't be. Maybe power taught men to survive without softness, and she had simply been the exception that proved his rule. Until the morning he showed up. A knock on the door. Not urgent, not desperate, just steady. Ava opened it and found Ethan standing there. The Pacific wind ruffling his coat, his face unshaven, eyes darker than she remembered. He looked like he hadn't slept, like he'd stopped pretending. I didn't come to beg, he said. I came to tell you the truth. She stepped back silent, letting him in. He walked into the cottage like someone stepping onto sacred ground. He took in the canvases, the scent of turpentine, the coffee on the stove. It was a life he hadn't seen before. A version of Ava he'd only ever glimpsed in stolen moments. I lost you, he said, turning to face her. And I know why. She didn't speak, but he didn't need her to. I thought I could protect you by distancing you, by absorbing the hit alone. That's what I was raised to do, solve problems without witnesses. But loving you isn't a problem. It never was. I just didn't know how to let someone fight beside me. She folded her arms, bracing herself. So why now? Because I'm done pretending I'm not afraid, he said. I'm afraid of losing you permanently. I'm afraid of becoming the man who keeps choosing legacy over love. I already know what it costs. I've lived with that cost my entire life. He stepped closer. Vanessa's lawsuit didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was that I didn't trust us to survive it. I thought I had to dismantle everything just to protect you, but all I did was walk away from the one thing in my life that was finally real. Ava looked at him for a long time. And what do you want now? She asked, not with anger but with cautious hope. I want to build something we don't have to run from, he said. Not just with my money, or my name, or a gallery. I want to build something with you that neither of us has ever had before. She shook her head, tears brimming. Ethan, I'm tired. I've rebuilt myself so many times, I don't know what I'd be if I trusted you again and it all burned down. He nodded, emotion flickering behind his composed facade. Then let me help carry it, not as a savior, as your equal. They stood there suspended in something that wasn't resolution, but the fragile edge of it. She stepped forward slowly, her hand reaching for his, and for the first time he didn't flinch. The next days unfolded with tentative grace. Ethan stayed in Santa Monica, renting a space a block away, not imposing, not demanding. They walked the beach in the early mornings, often without speaking. At night, they sat on the porch and watched the tide move in, as if watching time itself. Stitch them back together. One evening, Ava took him to a small gallery downtown where her work had quietly begun to sell again. Not because of who she was with, but because of what she'd created. A curator recognized Ethan immediately but didn't approach. That, more than any grand gesture, told her things could be different. After the show, they sat in her kitchen. "I sold the Napa estate," Ethan said quietly. Ava turned surprised. "Why?" "It was a place I built for solitude, but I don't want solitude anymore." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You don't have to give things up to be with me." "I want to," he said. "I want to make room." That night he didn't leave. He stayed, not as a guest, not as a powerful man reclaiming territory, but as someone learning how to be still, how to be vulnerable without apology. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ava whispered into the darkness, "I'm scared too." He pulled her close. "Then we'll be scared together." And in that moment, the pieces of themselves they had spent, years trying to protect, no longer felt like burdens. They felt like offerings. Like two souls standing bare before each other and choosing, despite the bruises, to begin again. Whatever came next, they would meet it hand in hand, not perfectly, but truthfully. And maybe finally, that was enough. The gallery in Sausalito was small, sunlit, and tucked into a quiet corner where the bay met the foot of the hills. It wasn't grand, but it was intimate. The kind of space where art could breathe and stories could speak for themselves. Ava Monroe had spent months shaping it, brushstroke by brushstroke, choice by deliberate choice. No name on the door, no mention of Ethan Blackwell's involvement, just her work and the stillness it evoked. The first day it opened, a woman stood in front of a large piece that Ava had nearly destroyed twice. It was a swirl of reds and greys, a chaos tamed only by a single arc of gold that cut through the middle like a wound healing in reverse. "She's finding herself again," the woman said aloud, not realizing Ava was behind her. Ava smiled quietly. "Yes, she is." She hadn't stopped painting since the morning Ethan had shown up at her door in Santa Monica. They hadn't rushed anything. Instead, they rebuilt slowly, through quiet mornings, vulnerable evenings, and the shared language of showing up again and again. Ethan had returned to San Francisco after a month by the sea, not to reclaim the empire, but to reshape it. He restructured his board, finalized Vanessa Langford's removal with silent precision, and stepped back from the media entirely. There were no announcements, no headlines, just action. When he asked Ava to join him at the reopening of the Blackwell Foundation's art residency program, she hesitated only for a breath. But this time, it wasn't fear that slowed her. It was power, the quiet new kind she carried inside herself. She said yes. The event was held in the newly renovated warehouse district, a space once derelict, now repurposed as an incubator for young artists. Ethan let her lead. He didn't speak over her or introduce her as his. He simply stood beside her, a partner, not a protector, not a benefactor. Just a man who had chosen her as much as she had chosen him. Later that night they walked along the marina in silence. The city lights shimmered on the surface of the water, distant and soft. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The rush, the power." Ethan took a moment. "I miss the illusion that it made me untouchable. But I don't miss who I had to be to maintain it." She nodded, understanding too well. He stopped walking, turned toward her, and reached into his coat pocket. "No grand gesture," he said. "Just something I've been carrying." It wasn't a ring box. It was a folded piece of paper, a handwritten letter. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning his words. In it he wrote of beginnings, of seeing her before he knew what it meant, of the quiet ache of losing her, of how he never wanted her to disappear again, but that if she did, he'd wait until time turned over itself to find her, and at the end, "I don't want a wedding. I want a life. If that includes vows, then say them when you're ready. But I already chose you, Ava. That part doesn't wait." Her throat tightened. She folded the letter, pressed it to her heart, and whispered, "Then I choose you back." There was no audience, no flash, no applause. Just two people on a quiet dock holding the simplest, rarest kind of promise. Not perfection, not forever, but presence. Months passed. The gallery thrived. So did Ava. She took on young artists, hosted workshops for teens recovering from trauma, and began selling limited prints whose proceeds supported mental health initiatives. She told her story not in interviews but in color, unapologetic and loud and painfully human. Ethan, meanwhile, remained quietly at her side. He launched a philanthropic initiative focused on creative recovery and healing through art. He didn't stamp his name on it. He didn't need to. And then, one morning, Ava sat on the edge of their shared bed, the light not yet touching the floor, and stared at a white plastic test in her hand. 2 lines. She didn't cry. She smiled. When she told Ethan later that day, his eyes welled with something deeper than surprise. He dropped into the nearest chair and covered his face with both hands. "I'm terrified," he said. "So am I," she replied, kneeling in front of him. "But maybe that means we're ready." He kissed her then, not with fire or hunger, but with reverence. 9 months later, in a sunlit birthing center overlooking the coast, they welcomed a daughter. They named her Elise. She had Ava's eyes and Ethan's quiet defiance. And when she wrapped her tiny fingers around her mother's thumb, Ava understood something profound. This wasn't the end of her story. This was the beginning of one she had never dared to imagine. Later that week, standing at the gallery, Ava unveiled a new piece. A large canvas, soft but bold, tones of blue and amber, a horizon breaking wide open. No title, no explanation, just a plaque that read, "For the miracle I didn't see coming." And beneath it 3 words, Ava Monroe Blackwell. It was never about love at first sight. It was about trust rebuilt, truth uncovered, and the kind of love that chooses you again and again, especially when it's hardest, especially when it's real. Ava Monroe's journey wasn't a straight line to success or love. It was a winding path filled with betrayal, self-doubt, healing, and ultimately courage, from a once rising artist betrayed by the man she trusted. Most to a woman who found herself unintentionally tangled in the life of a guarded billionaire. Ava's transformation was rooted not in romance alone, but in reclamation. She didn't become whole because Ethan Blackwell loved her. She became whole because she remembered how to love herself first. And in doing so, she opened the door for a deeper, more authentic connection than either of them had known. Ethan Blackwell, on the other hand, began as a man who controlled everything. His time, his image, his heart. But through Ava's presence, he confronted the ghosts of his past, tore down the walls he had built, and discovered that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the foundation of real strength. Together, they didn't create a fairy tale. They built something far more rare. A love that honored each other's wounds, one that grew slowly, truthfully, and without pretense. Their story reminds us that healing takes time. That love isn't about perfection, or about someone saving you from yourself. It's about finding someone who sees you in your darkest moments and stays. It's about choosing each other again and again, not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard. The lesson here is this: true love starts with self-respect. You cannot build a life with someone else until you've made peace with your own. In today's fast-moving, image-obsessed world, we're taught to chase validation, to perform instead of connect. But Ava and Ethan's story tells us something different. Slow down, listen, open yourself up to the hard conversations, and trust that love, when rooted in truth, can not only survive but thrive. How can you apply this today? Maybe it's reaching out to someone with whom you've avoided a difficult conversation. Maybe it's walking away from a situation that asks you to dim your light. Or maybe it's simply taking the first step toward rediscovering the dreams you once abandoned. Whatever it is, the reminder is clear. You are allowed to rewrite your story, no matter where you are in it. Now let's test your memory a bit with a quick question. Which moment marked the emotional turning point in Ava and Ethan's relationship? A. When Ethan offered to fund Ava's art gallery. B. When Ethan showed up at Ava's cottage in Santa Monica with a handwritten letter. Drop your answer in the comments, A or B. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What part of Ava and Ethan's journey resonated with you the most? Comment below and share your perspective. Your voice might be the one that inspires someone else today. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep bringing you stories that move, heal, and remind you of the power of love, truth, and resilience. See you in the next one.